Mr. Chair, point of information, please. Since what Mr. McNamara is going to do is primarily testimony, I would request that he be sworn in.
He will be.
All right. Thank you very much.
I already had it covered.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Before I do that, I do have a statement that I'm going to make prior to this committee. So the committee members and anyone watching today, we are going to continue our discussion on unemployment insurance with our next presenter. Muncie Mcnamara is the former executive director of the Office of Unemployment Insurance. Many of you may be familiar with his name from the report last week from the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting. He is here today to provide some background on the issues within the administration as they pertain to unemployment insurance. As always, we will have an opportunity to ask questions when he is finished with his testimony. I want to stress that this is a fact-finding mission, and anyone who tells you it is about politics hasn't talked to any of the thousands of Kentuckians who have gone months without benefits. They haven't walked down the line of hundreds of men and women who travel to Frankfort to stand in the hot sun for hours to have their claims resolved. We were finalizing this agenda yesterday when news broke that another breach occurred this week, driving home the fact that problems still exist even though we were told they had been fixed. Mr. McNamara, I want to thank you for joining us today. Before we do that, I do want to swear you in, but I would ask that you first identify yourself and the position that you held before we do that, for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Muncie Mcnamara, and I was the Executive Director of the Office of Unemployment Insurance from January 16th until I was let go on May 5th of this year.
If you'll raise your right hand now and swear, do you swear to affirm or tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, you may begin with your presentation.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having me here today. I'm here to address, to the best of my knowledge and recollection, the circumstances surrounding the Office of Unemployment Insurance's response to the COVID-19 outbreak and the closure of Kentucky's economy. First, I think we must all acknowledge that this was an emotional, an extremely stressful and chaotic time for everyone involved. I think I read where the governor recalled this time as being messy and emotional, and given what I've experienced, that's an accurate statement. I think the primary question on people's minds is what planning went into the UI response and what steps we took to execute that response and what went wrong. The governor closed businesses on March 16th of this year. I believe Deputy Secretary Benton previously testified that he was not included in any meetings with the governor's office related to that decision or the timing of the closures. Neither was I. I had a hunch it was coming. I think we all kind of suspected that it was coming, but we had no idea when the governor was going to do that. But when the governor issued the closure orders, we knew that UI was going to be significantly impacted. Following the closure order, so the governor closed businesses on March 16th. On the following Saturday, March 20th, I received a call from Deputy Secretary Benton, and he told me, unfortunately, that he knew someone who had taken their own life because their business was closed under the governor's orders, and they were a self-employed individual who otherwise would not be covered by unemployment, and they simply didn't know what they were going to do because their business was shut down. So they were not eligible for unemployment benefits. This was clearly a tragedy, and it hit very close to home for the deputy secretary. Again, this was an emotional time for everyone. And the deputy secretary told me he wanted to find a way to start paying benefits to people whose jobs were affected by COVID-19, including those who were otherwise ineligible for benefits, such as the self-employed and independent contractors. He also stated he wanted to do this as soon as possible, and he did not want to wait for the feds, meaning the U.S. Department of Labor, to act. He wanted Kentucky to take the lead in this. The deputy secretary asked me to find a way where we could accomplish this and and asked me to put it in a memo that he could present to the governor later that afternoon. I did prepare a memo that relied on unemployment insurance program letter. We refer to them as UPLs, 10-20 dated March 12th. That UPL was basically the first guidance that the Department of Labor had put out relating to anything COVID and business-related, unemployment-related due to COVID. They were responding, obviously, this had already started having a massive impact on the West Coast, so they were starting to address that. That UPL provided states with additional flexibility to pay benefits to uninsured workers. It allowed us to do things like waive work search requirements and be more flexible with the able and available requirements. And it indicated that we could consider potentially paying some of these unemployed or the self-employed, otherwise uncovered people. So that was the basis of my memo that I provided to the Deputy Secretary. He later presented it to the governor, and he then told me later that the governor had signed off and agreed with the plan to go ahead and move forward with trying to pay people. At that point, we were off to the races. We would proceed with our plans and not wait for any federal guidance or federal sign-off. It also became clear that the governor wanted us to act quickly to mitigate the fallout from the closure orders. Unfortunately, fast is not possible in this situation. The UI system was never intended to cover the self-employed or independent contractors. It just wasn't. They're not, unemployment taxes are not paid on them. So covering these individuals, these groups required numerous and significant changes to an antiquated computer system that struggled to handle any new changes. Changes could only be made a few at a time and then tested before implementation. This all took time. Given the crush of new claims we started receiving, it was impossible to both make the necessary changes and proceed and process the new claims. At the same time, the pressure from the governor's office was growing. It was very clear that the Office of Unemployment needed to find a way to pay all claims and pay everybody as quickly as possible. Frankly, had we taken more time to plan, make these computer changes ahead of time, before we started accepting and processing claims, a lot of this could have been avoided. I'll answer any questions, but I do address that. But we needed to do things like we were supposed to set up a separate application for the self-employed people. The idea to auto pay 2 weeks, well, that's never been the first 2 weeks. That's never been a part of the system. That required significant computer adjustments, system adjustments to do that, which of course, auto paying weeks was not something allowed by the federal government anyway. So there were a lot of changes where if we had just taken some time, and thought through a plan, thought through how we wanted to start and bringing in especially the people that otherwise weren't covered and started making the necessary computer changes before we started accepting new applications related to this, where we could have avoided a lot of what we're seeing on the back end here with applications that didn't get processed properly. Making matters worse, the U.S. Department of Labor continued to issue additional UPLs, which were making new policy, changing or clarifying policies, even telling states what they can't do, often in response to states doing something that they didn't like. Every new UPL meant we had to react, and that meant more computer changes and policy changes. This in turn created more confusion and backlog. It seemed as if I was trying to build an airplane while I was flying it. Looking back now, I think the response should have been less reactionary and more measured. Numerous other states delayed paying benefits until the federal government supplied a clearer picture of what policies and resources were available to states to deal with this crisis. Remember, and it was mentioned in previous testimony, or the previous testimony today, we started paying benefits before the CARES Act passed. We were quick to react, which is what I was instructed to do. When the CARES Act passed, that meant creating 3 new unemployment programs that had never existed before, and that again created additional computer problems to implement those programs, and then administering a total of 4 programs when before we were just administering 1. It meant creating entire new computer programs to implement the CARES Act programs, again further complicating matters and increasing confusion. Simply waiting for federal guidance and making the computer system changes first would have had a significant impact on streamlining the administration of the program. This does not mean we had to shut down for months or wait to start paying claims until April 24th, like the state of Indiana did. It was a matter of waiting a few weeks and then back paying benefits to the date of the original claim. Instead, we were constantly reacting and trying to catch up. The policy pillars here were essentially pay everyone and do it fast, not let's get it right, let's wait for the federal guidance. The message that I received over and over again was essentially, we're doing this, we're pushing ahead. If the feds tell us they don't like it, then we'll ask for forgiveness. As the number of claims increased, along with the call volume, the pressure from the governor's office increased. It was clear to me that whatever we had to do, just do it. Even cut corners, whatever. Don't worry about the feds. This is what the governor wants, so just do it. The directive, get help to workers fast and fix it later, was hammered home every day during the governor's press conference. He continually told the public that UI was not doing a good job and we needed to do better. My employees, career merit staff, who had sometimes decades of experience with unemployment, were killing themselves to try to process these claims. Most of them were working 7 days a week, countless hours of overtime, processing and adjudicating claims. These are knowledgeable, hardworking people who had to listen to the governor tell them every day what a bad job they were doing, when they actually cared deeply about their work and how it was perceived. I had multiple employees ask me if I could do anything to get the governor to stop throwing them under the bus. I mean, morale was terrible. The governor, without consulting anyone in the unemployment system, not the deputy secretary, not myself, closed businesses. Then, in consultation with the deputy secretary, decided to start paying benefits to everyone immediately without having a concrete plan on how to accomplish this. Then was upset when things did not go the way he hoped. Again, the governor said it. It was a messy and emotional time. What happened with the UI response to COVID mirrored what happened with the national response. A lack of clear guidance from above resulted in reactive, ad hoc measures below, leading to inconsistency and confusion. The logical and even likely result of such is an ineffective response and subsequent lack of faith in the system. I'm not here to blame. I'm here to accept my share of responsibility. I was there when many of the early decisions were made, when we were putting these plans into place. I wrote the memo providing a basis for expanding UI coverage. I oversaw the implementation of the new CARES Act programs. I suggested some of the shortcuts to try and get claims paid faster. I also did not object to policies I knew ran counter to federal guidelines. However, as things progressed, I began to have issues with certain decisions that were being made over my head. The biggest issue I had was with the outside third-party call center type vendors. At first, we contracted with outside vendors to help with answering the phone calls. At the peak, when we were getting new claims filed, the phones were also getting overwhelmed. During this time, we had an average of 100,000 calls a day. On the heavy days, we would get 200,000 calls a day. We started using call centers to help answer calls so people could get an answer when they called, putting a voice on the phone so people didn't feel like they were just going into a black hole. The idea that we were always driving to was to get 1,000 additional bodies answering the assistance line. Although in my time there, I never saw 1,000 people actually logged in answering phone calls at any given time. There may have been that many bodies available, but they weren't all on the phones at the same time. The call center vendors could answer calls and provide basic answers to basic questions. We called these Tier 1. We set up an escalating tier system for the phone lines in an attempt to triage and manage who was getting what calls. Tier 1 answered the phones and answered basic questions. If they could not assist someone, they would escalate the call to Tier 2 or Tier 3, depending on the needs of the caller. Tier 2 could assist with things like identity verification, resetting people's PIN numbers. Initially, everyone working at Tier 2 was a state employee because Tier 2 needed access to the UI computer systems in order to log into somebody's account or profile and change their PIN, verify their identity. Tier 3 handled the complicated questions about individual claims, and that was comprised essentially entirely of career state employees who worked in the Office of Unemployment in the benefits branch division there. These are longtime UI staffers. Eventually, the number of people calling, needing assistance with PIN resets and ID verification grew so large that the decision was made to allow the call centers access to the computer system so they could start handling Tier 2 calls. The decision was made by Deputy Secretary Benton and the Executive Director of HR at the Cabinet for Education and Workforce Development. I did not feel comfortable giving computer access to all these call center employees because they would have access to individual personal identifying information, and I thought the risk of identity theft was too great. I provided a written objection to the Deputy Secretary, the Commissioner of Workforce Investment, and the Executive Director of HR. This letter is included in my personnel file, and it is dated April 23rd. Coincidentally, a data breach did occur at the same time I was raising my objection to the call centers. That's the first data breach that the administration acknowledged. As had been widely reported, they acknowledged the data breach on April 23rd when a claimant called stating that she was seeing someone else's personal information in her documents folder. This is only partially true. I was notified a day before of another data breach, the first one that we knew about. The executive director over the career centers forwarded me an email. One of the people that were working in the career centers had talked to a claimant, and the claimant said they were seeing somebody else's documents in their folder, in their personal information. That got back up to the executive director for the career centers, who forwarded me an email that included the driver's license of the wrong person that this person was seeing. This was obviously a computer problem. It was obviously an issue, so I forwarded the email to the executive director for OTS. She's the head of IT basically for the cabinet, and the deputy secretary. I did not receive a response that day. The next day, the second breach happened, essentially the same thing. Somebody called saying they were seeing somebody else's documents in their documents folder. When the second breach happened, I raised the issue again because I talked to this individual on the telephone. I raised the issue again. And that's when the reaction happened. That's when they shut down access. They just closed it off so no one could see any documents for the time being while they tried to patch the issue. But that was the second one. I had forwarded them the initial one a day earlier. So they knew about it a day before they've acknowledged that there was an issue. Unfortunately, I've been trying to get the email that I sent the first day, but despite my open records requests, I've been denied access to virtually all but a small handful of my emails, so I can only discuss this from my memory. The other issue was when we were dealing with the woman who had called on the phone, the one that set off the real alarm bells. When I was corresponding with her, getting back to her on the phone to tell her what the result was, because she wanted to know what had happened. I was basically instructed to let her know that this was an isolated incident. I don't know why the breach was not reported to the Attorney General's office at the time. During these same few days, I raised another objection about an appointment to the Unemployment Commission. On April 24th, I objected to the appointment of the Deputy General Counsel at the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet to the UI Commission. The UI Commission is the second level of appeal in the unemployment system. The Deputy General Counsel was very involved in advising me on the UI programs. She was in meetings where we discussed our approach to setting up new programs, creating standards and guidelines for administering these programs and evaluating claims under the new programs. As a member of the Unemployment Commission, she sits in judgment of these same standards that she helped create. She has knowledge of what you might call the intent or the spirit of what we were trying to accomplish. Her inside knowledge of strategy meetings and conversations with me, I believe, prevented her from being impartial because she knew what we were trying to do, but she's not necessarily evaluating things just on the letter of the law. This actually works to the benefit of the cabinet and not the claimants, who deserve and expect impartial appeals. I raised these concerns on the morning of April 24th. At 5 p.m. that afternoon, I received a written corrective action plan. The letter listed several areas of my performance needing improvement, including professionalism, responding to emails faster. But curiously, it also stated that I was not to comment on appointments to the UI Commission any longer. I followed up later that evening with my direct superior, the Commissioner of Workforce Investment, and he acknowledged to me in text message that the reprimand was really about my comments on the UI Commission. At present, that Deputy General Counsel does sit on the UI Commission. The next week I came into work on Tuesday, April 28th. I came into work on the Monday, worked Monday, and then on Tuesday, April 28th, I informed the Commissioner and the Deputy Secretary that I was having chest pains and shortness of breath. I left that day around 3:34 p.m. and called my cardiologist, who told me to go to the emergency room. I went to the ER where my blood pressure was nearing stroke level. The doctor informed me this was largely stress related. Again, this was an emotional time for me as well. I was discharged and instructed to follow up with my cardiologist. On April 29th, I went into work in the morning before I had to leave for my appointment with my cardiologist. And I met with the commissioner and the head of HR. And the head of HR instructed me that she wanted me to get a letter from my cardiologist stating that I was safe to work in a high-stress environment, since the doctor had told me that this was stress-related blood pressure. I went to my cardiologist that afternoon, and she took me off work. She put me on blood pressure medication, took me off work for the next 3 business days, and then gave me a letter stating that I was safe to work in a high-stress environment. After those 3 days, on April 29th was a Wednesday when I went to my cardiologist, so I was off work that Thursday and that Friday. Then there was the weekend, and then I was off the following Monday. Those were the 3 business days. I returned to work on Tuesday, May 5th in the morning. During this whole time, I was getting there around 7:30 in the morning. At 9:30, the Commissioner Marty Hammonds and Mary Elizabeth Bailey from the Personnel Cabinet came to my office and presented me with my termination letter. Between April 24th, when I was reprimanded, and May 5th, when I was fired, I was at work for probably a total of 2.5 days. The letter I received stated I was fired without cause. I asked for a reason for the firing, and I was not provided one. I had been at work for about 2.5 days total from the corrective action memo to the firing, and in the middle I was being treated for a medical condition, and all of this was immediately on the heels of my raising concerns about the direction of the Office of Unemployment. After I was fired, I was contacted by current employees of the Office of Unemployment who, out of loyalty, told me that I was being scapegoated for the problems with UI, and for some reason, I was informed everyone's phones were confiscated after my firing for a period of time. For these reasons, I believe I was fired in retaliation for raising these concerns about the unemployment system and not being a team player and just going along. Finally, I know it was raised in a previous hearing about my qualifications for the position, how I came to receive the position, and I'd like to briefly address that. First of all, I am an attorney. I practiced 10 years primarily in the area of administrative law, so I was very familiar with administrative practice procedure. When I walked in my first day on the job, I inherited an office that was severely understaffed. The average hold time on the assistance line was over an hour, and there were already tens of thousands of backlogged claims. Within just a couple of weeks, I had managed to get hold times on the assistance line down to an average of around 20 minutes, and on a good day as little as 9 minutes. I also started working on plans to address the backlog claims, and I and the Deputy Secretary and the Executive Director of HR were making plans for adding additional staff to the office. The office was in disarray when I arrived, and very quickly I managed to make tangible improvements and create concrete plans for further improvement. Even when COVID hit and everything went sideways, I still showed up every day, ready to work, trying to attack problems. I walked out of that doctor's office with a note that said I was safe to work, and I was ready to go back to work when I was cleared and go. And I did. I showed up the very first day that I could, ready to work and keep attacking what we were dealing with. This has been a crisis and a terrible tragedy. But I really viewed my position when this all happened as an opportunity to try and actually really serve the people of Kentucky when they really needed it the most. I was disappointed that I wasn't able to fulfill that mission. Thank you. Just also on the tail end, some of the questions that were asked to the previous witness about some of the taxes and things like that, I can probably address some of those questions that were brought up, particularly Senator Higdon, some of your questions. So if you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to address those as well and clarify things. But thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McNamara, for your testimony. I've got a couple of questions myself here. So if I understand correctly, based on what you've indicated and I've heard previously testimony before this committee, was there any coordination between the governor's office and your office, the department that you oversaw, that would implement the payment of unemployment benefits? Was there any prior discussion with your office on the shutdown, your ability or capacity to issue checks to folks in the Commonwealth? Was there any prior discussion prior to the shutdown?
No, certainly not with me. I believe in conversations with Deputy Secretary Benton, he wasn't included in the meetings about when and how things were going to get shut down. So, like I said, we had a hunch it was all coming at some point, but we weren't sure when. I think we probably figured it out through various news reports and things when he was actually going to do it that Monday. I think we probably found out the way the public did as well. So no, there was not any, we're doing it this day, are you going to be able to handle it on as soon as we shut these things down? No.
So what I understand from your testimony is that you set in, you tackled the office. There were some setbacks that you were dealing with, but you attempted to make the best of it and operate your office efficiently. Do you think, in your opinion, was the shutdown and the lack of inclusion with your office, the office that would oversee that and administrate that, was that setting the unemployment office up for a program failure?
Yes, probably, in my opinion. I mean, like I said, looking back on it, we should have taken a more reasonable and measured response. And this didn't mean waiting a long, long time. Ohio, just looking at in conversations I had with neighboring states and their my counterparts in those states, they were very much waiting for all the federal guidance to come out and have everything perfect and ready to go before they acted. And we didn't need to do that, but we needed to take a little bit more time to come up with the plan of how are we going to pay these people that otherwise aren't covered. And how are we going to administer that portion of the program? Because that's probably a separate application for those people that needs to be created and put up on the computer. That's creating a new pathway in the computer system for when these people apply for their benefits, so that they're not being included, so that for tracking purposes they're not being included the same as regular insured covered people. And all of those things take a lot of computer programming. The computer program was set up so that, normally we have wage information for covered employers or employees. We don't have that for self-employed or independent contractors. So we needed to create a mechanism where they could submit income verification for us so that we could establish their benefit rate. None of that existed before. And so it just, the time to sit down and go through it and come up with a plan and talk to the IT department about what computer changes need to be made and allowing them to make the changes and testing them so that when we opened it up, we wouldn't have a lot of these hiccups. A lot of the initial claims that got held up and denied were getting denied because the computer system traditionally would deny people that don't have enough wages that are identifying them. And so they were just getting denied. And that change hadn't been made. We made it eventually, but if we had made it before, then a lot of people wouldn't have gotten denied that were actually going to be eligible. And given how quickly we actually did react to everything, when we figured out, well, we got to do this now. And, all credit to the OTS and COT on all of this, because they were working constantly just trying to make all the computer changes that needed to be changed. Had we had some time where we could think about what we needed to have done to accommodate these new class of people, and then make the computer system changes before we started accepting those applications, then a lot of especially the early problems could have been avoided.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of weeks.
As we proceed on with the questions, I want to ask members to keep your questions concise. We have a hard exit time today of 10:15. Mr. McNamara, if you can keep your responses concise.
Yes,
and
sir.
I would, Co-Chair Carroll has questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McNamara, I know that there was some discussion about unemployment claims for inmates that were being released from prison by the governor. Can you talk a little bit about that? And was there conversations, was there a request to do that by the governor? And what was the result of that?
The conversation I had was with Deputy Secretary Benton. I rarely, if ever, spoke directly to the governor. The Deputy Secretary spoke with the governor. And when the governor started releasing commuting sentences to address the overcrowding in the prisons because of COVID, the question came to me through Deputy Secretary Benton about whether or not we could pay these benefits to the prisoners he was releasing. And I emphatically said no. Nothing ever came of that. It seemed to be the end of that answer. But the question was posed to me, and I said no way, because they had no connection to the workforce whatsoever. At least the self-employed had, a connection to the workforce.
Okay, and just one other question, and I'll move on. You mentioned something about telephones being collected from your staff when you left. Did I hear that correctly?
That was relayed to me by somebody that worked in the office in a conversation after I was fired. They told me that after I was fired, and so I have no personal knowledge of this. I'll make that clear. I have no personal knowledge. This is a hearsay story that was told to me that apparently they gathered up people's phones after I left and collected them for a period of time, which they're state phones.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'll let others ask questions.
Senator Higdon.
Muncie, thank you for being here today. And you're a constituent of mine. You live in Bardstown.
Yes, sir.
Yes, and I want to acknowledge that. Under the current, and I've said this many a times, we've created a crisis in a crisis, and I still have constituents. Many of us still have constituents who, since the middle of March, 16 weeks have not received their unemployment benefits. Unemployment is a safety net. When someone is out of work, then this is a safety net, and that safety net's not there. So that's why I call it a crisis in a crisis. And I will compliment, like you said, the staff. They have been over backwards and been very dedicated to try to help. Anytime that we called, the LRC staff and constituent services have worked very hard to try to help our constituents. Couple things I want, and I'll run through these because I do want to get back to the questions about the unemployment that what I have with Ashley and get those. So I won't really ask any questions. I do have we will all acknowledge that the system's antiquated. It's even on a good day. I don't know if you, and I know you've seen the paperwork that goes, or the questions that goes along with filing for unemployment, and they're brutal. It's very easy to make a mistake and to get your claim kicked out. And the whole system needs to be revamped. We understand that, including self-employed and contract and gig workers. That was another big issue that complicated the issue, and the small staff. I guess here's what the things that I see, and I just want you to acknowledge. I'll say them all at one time, not individually. I think one of the biggest issues is just the enormity of the issue was underestimated when this all started. I don't think the administration realized the enormity of what the unemployment or the demand for checks was going to be. I just think they severely underestimated the demand. One of the things, another part of the crisis, I think, was not having a separate system for those self-employed to try to put them through the system, and the system rejected almost unless you were in the system, and from what I gather from people I've talked to, if they'd never drawn unemployment before and they weren't in the system, it automatically rejected them and said that they were under investigation, which caused a whole nother set of grief for constituents. And it also, as we continue to work through this, it seemed like that there was anybody that had any type of complications with their account, they were simply skipped over and kept working on the easier, problems. And those with complicated problems or those that need special attention were simply moved down the list. And I'll let you comment on those and then ask you a few questions about the pool account and state unemployment.
I would agree with some and disagree with some of that. I don't think we were, with really complicated questions, we were kicking it down the road. I think the better way to characterize it is that there were a handful of people that could deal with the really complicated issues. Okay, the career staff, all right? And when we were responding to this, we were all hands on deck at the cabinet, and we were pulling in people from all over, particularly the workforce side of the cabinet, and training them to do adjudications, right? Which is somebody has an issue that is raised about their claim and needs to be investigated, and we were training them to do that. We were training the way that's a very complicated world. We were able to take people who weren't familiar with it and train them just to do one discrete issue, so they could just learn one thing, and then they were able to help out. But if it was truly a more complicated, complex issue, then it would have to go to the people who had been doing that, either in the benefits branch or the adjudications branch. And there were 25 adjudicators and 20 people in the benefits branch. So there were only a handful of people that could do those. So it wasn't that they were being passed over. It was if the people that were trained to handle one issue, if they were getting something that was truly complicated, they were having to send it to the people that really had the experience, the career experience dealing with those issues. And there was a finite number of those people and a tremendous amount of claims, and they just couldn't get to them fast enough.
Well, thank you. And I do think the staff, and now with the labor cabinet, there is an effort to try to get all this resolved. I don't disagree with that there is, the staff is making huge efforts to get everybody taken care of, just overwhelmed. Mr. Chairman, one more question about the previous unemployment rates.
Can we come back to that? I've got a whole list here.
I know that. Thank you.
We can talk after.
Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I could. Mr. McNamara, thank you for being here today and your testimony. I just want to clarify something very quickly. I understood you correctly. Within hours of taking office back in December, the governor, he restored the voting rights of thousands of felons here in Kentucky. And then under the state of emergency, he issued 2 executive orders, and I'm just wanting to make sure I'm understanding, releasing state prisoners from prison, and then he asked the Office of Unemployment Insurance to provide these people with benefits. And if the answer to that is yes, then I guess, are these people unemployed because they're no longer in prison? Is that why that maybe he thought that they should qualify? I know we made some exceptions, but that is a pretty long stretch to try to say that they're unemployed simply because they got released from prison, and we're going to provide them with benefits that was designed to protect people when they're out of work. And in this situation, because of the pandemic, would you care to elaborate on that for me, please?
Yes, I think I would characterize it or clarify what I said earlier. The governor or Secretary Benton, on behalf of the governor, didn't ask to provide benefits to release prisoners. He asked if it was possible, which I think is an important distinction. I wasn't said find a way to provide these people benefits. It was, can we do it? We're covering other people who are otherwise uninsured. Is it possible to include these people in that? And I emphatically said no, because the key issue is, even for self-employed and independent contractors, is they had a connection to the workforce. You had to have some connection to the workforce. And obviously prisoners, because they were in jail, didn't have a connection to the workforce. And so I said no, and it didn't go any further than that. But the question was posed to me, is it possible? Could we do it? Not, I want to do it. It was just, could we do it? And I think that's the distinction.
Understood, but one could reasonably assume here that because the question was asked, the intent was there if it was possible.
I mean, I can't speak to what the governor was thinking or why he wanted to do it or why, I think he was just, I have no idea what he was thinking. But we were covering a whole lot of people who otherwise weren't covered ever before. But I can't speak to intent or what would have gone on. All I can say is that the question was posed to me. I said it was not possible, and it didn't go any further than that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Banda.
In prior testimony, Deputy Secretary Benton believed that the first breach occurred on April 23rd. In prior testimony, Secretary Benton believed that the first breach occurred on April 23rd. Your timeline seems a little bit different. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I can. And I look back at what has been stated publicly about the data breach by the administration. I think when they first acknowledged it in the press conference, they acknowledged that one happened on April 23rd. In subsequent follow-ups, I think there was a report on July 9th or so, they've acknowledged that there were two, but they found out about them on April 23rd. I found out the April 23rd one was the one that got everybody's attention. But I was made aware of a possible data breach a day before that because another executive director, one of his employees, was speaking with a constituent that was saying, I'm seeing somebody else's documents when I log into my file, into my claim. And he didn't know what it was, and so it got sent to him, and he sent it to me, and he said, do you know what's going on with this? And I had no idea. So I forwarded it to the head of IT and the deputy secretary, and I said, what's going on here? Do we know what this is? And I didn't get a response that day. Then the next morning, a different person called, basically demanded to speak to someone in charge, and they put them in touch with me, and I spoke with them on the phone, and then that became the one that really got the response, where we went in, shut down the computers, and went in and tried to figure it out. But there was one. It was less of a. It's not a smaller data breach, because a data breach is a data breach. But there was one that we were really confused, and it was like, what is this thing? And we forwarded it on, and it didn't get a response. But I was made aware of it, and I forwarded it on via email a day before the one that got everybody's attention occurred. So at least I can say that I was aware of a potential data breach a day before, and I forwarded it on to the head of OTS and the head of and the deputy secretary that day. I mean, but I did it via email. I didn't talk to them about it. We were all running around places. I did it via email, and again, we were getting thousands of emails a day, so it's quite possible that they didn't see it. Okay, that may be the simple explanation. But I know that I was made aware of essentially the same issue, where somebody was seeing somebody else's documents in their folder a day before the one that was acknowledged publicly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Representative Maddox.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. McNamara also for coming in and being willing to speak with us on these issues and providing a recollection. I think it's very important with a problem of this magnitude to have a thorough understanding of what transpired, what went wrong, so that we can avoid this ever happening again. But just after having learned about the first data breach, which we realized may now have been the second data breach, just wanted to circle back. At that time, I'd done some research, and it looks like under KRS 61.933 that there's a requirement to report to the Attorney General within 72 hours, and I just wondered if you were aware of that universal notification form that apparently came into effect under former Governor Steve Beshear in 2014. So it's been around a while. Just wondered if you were aware of that, if you were advised of its existence, and if you used it.
I was not aware of the mandatory reporting to the Attorney General's office, but that is why I sent it to, when I found about the first one, I forwarded it on to the head of OTS and the deputy secretary. I would assume those people have been around in state government, that they would be aware of it. I do not know why it was not reported to the Attorney General's office. I know that what has been stated publicly, I think in a previous hearing, General Counsel Amy Cubbage stated it was an issue in the legal department at the cabinet. So, but I was not aware of it, but I forwarded it on to the head of OTS, who I would think would be aware of that requirement.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. And at the time of your departure, had anything material been done to address the breach itself or any of the underlying causes that may have attributed to that? And more importantly, do you see that any protocol has been put into place to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Kind of give us an idea, if you would, please, about what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I have very limited knowledge of the computer, okay? So I can't speak to what OTS did to address the problem, okay? I know that once it became, once everybody knew about the second breach, the one that got everybody's attention, they did immediately, what they were able to go do was to stop the problem from happening, was go in and turn the system so that no one could see any documents in the documents folder. So if you went in, just nobody could see anybody's documents, theirs, anybody else's, whatever. Okay, so you weren't going to get the issue where somebody's going to see somebody else's information. And then I believe they did. They spent the day frantically figuring out what happened and going in and trying to patch the flaw in the system. Obviously, it happened again yesterday. So how effective that was, I don't know. I will tell you that with the old computer system, we ran into the same problem over and over and over again, where they would go make a change to something, okay, that we requested, right? We want to auto pay the first 2 weeks. So we're going to remove it. So for the first 2 weeks, people don't have to go request those benefits, right? You make that change to the system and it ends up affecting something else. And we don't know what that something else is going to be until it happens. That happened over and over and over again, where they'd make a computer system change and then and it was just the oddities of the computer system and the old mainframe that they were working on off of. I mean, the mainframe, the system, the Q system is more recent, but the old mainframe they were dealing with is from like the early 80s, and it still uses a computer programming language called COBOL, which hasn't been used, I think, since the 80s almost. It's antiquated. So they'd change one thing and something would get screwed up, and they'd have to change that or fix that, right? And then it might screw something else up. And so it was just this constant. So my guess, and I have no idea because I have no idea about computer stuff. My guess is they went and we asked them to change something. They did it, and it put in some bug that allowed that flaw in the system. Now, I don't know why it happened again.
Well, absolutely. And again, I appreciate that. And I think that generally speaking, this whole situation has kind of added insult to injury in so much as we have so many folks across the Commonwealth that have waited great lengths of time to receive their unemployment benefits. And now, in the context of knowing that there have been these security breaches, I think it just furthermore evidences the fact that we have to be able to address this and move forward in a way that restores the public trust. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I think we have Representative Elliott remotely. Representative Elliott, ask your question.
My question is related to if you are aware of Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? I think I'm-
Yes, we can.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. McNamara.
Good morning.
My question is related to whether you are aware of a category or a wholesale clearance of stops being approved, which basically allowed people to receive unemployment without any investigation. Are you aware of that happening?
Yeah, I am. Yes, that was one of the things that we did, to try and clear the just crush of claims that we were receiving. A stop is you file your application for benefits, and it gets evaluated. The system evaluates it, and if there's some issue, it could be a separation issue with your employer. It could be an income issue. If there's some issue, it'll throw what's called a stop on the claim so that the payment doesn't issue to you. And it has to be investigated to see what the holdup is, why that stop was thrown up. It could be any number of things. There are a whole bunch of different categories of stops. Some of the stops that were thrown on were kind of appropriate to do that because it was like a lack of earnings history or a lack of employment history, because that was the self-employed people or the independent contractors. Some stops that were cleared needed more detailed investigation. The problem, however, is whether or not it was appropriate because the stop was thrown on for a lack of employment history because you were an independent contractor. The problem is the federal regulations, the Department of Labor regulations, require that each claim be individually adjudicated and cleared. It doesn't allow for the wholesale clearing of stops. So whether, practically speaking, that was a good idea to try and get people paid, legally speaking, you can't do that. You have to investigate each individual claim.
And is there a way to make sure that those claims were properly processed and adjudicated once they've been approved? Is there a way to go back and determine that?
No. I mean, once they're cleared, there's really not.
And do we know how many of those were? Do you have a number on how many of those were?
I don't off the top of my head. I know that the numbers were discussed at the time we were doing them, and I'm sure that there's an email that exists somewhere that was in my email where the number is there, but I don't have access to that email.
Is it in the thousands? Is it in the thousands? Fair to say it's in the thousands?
It's probably an underestimate.
And is that, in your opinion, is doing that against the law to clear those as you've described? Is that?
I will say that
I
will say that the federal government, the Department of Labor, the United States administrator for the federal unemployment system got wind that we were doing that and told us that we had to stop and couldn't do that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Representative Beckler, I believe you're on remotely.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. McNamara, I was in my first term when we passed the legislation requiring data breaches to be reported to the Attorney General. That was in 2014. This kind of touches on a question that Representative Maddox already asked. I vaguely remember actually the day that Governor Steve Beshear signed it into law. Can you tell me if you know what the protocol is when a breach has been detected, and are you aware of a form developed by the Finance Cabinet to meet the requirements of this law?
I believe I'm aware of a form, but I don't know that I was at the time. I don't know what the cabinet's protocols were for dealing with that. I felt my obligation was to report it to the IT department, essentially, and that's what I did.
Thank you, Mr. McNamara. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Senator Berg.
What type of shape would you say the Commonwealth's unemployment system was when you started in the cabinet?
It was in trouble. It was not doing well. Like I said, when I walked in, the wait times on the telephones were over an hour. on average, and there was already a backlog of claims in the tens of thousands. Before I got there, in previous years, there'd been a lot of attrition in the office, and a lot of changes in how the things were structured, and it essentially left the office pretty understaffed from what a real
Thank
good
you. I think you've
functioning.
answered the question. My understanding is under the previous Republican administration and Republican supermajority, 31 unemployment insurance offices across the state were closed, leaving 12 career centers open to serve 120 counties in this state. That the Bevan reorganization also resulted in the loss of 95 trained unemployment insurance specialists who could have been extremely helpful from the beginning in addressing this crisis, and that budgetary cuts under the previous Bevan administration reduced the operating budget from $41 million to $25 million in 2017. So I'm assuming that you walked into this job knowing that you were facing a system that had been intentionally decimated by our prior administration. What hurdles did you encounter when you trying to increase your Tier 3 staff?
Well, yes. I mean, they closed a lot of the field offices. We opened them back up, and we put not all of them, but we opened several.
How many?
We started with 11, and then we kept opening some more regional offices to spread it out and put unemployment back into the field. Basically, we did that. The budget, in terms of the operating budget for the Office of Unemployment, the administrative budget is federally funded. So it's the trust fund is funded by state taxes, the employer taxes, but the administrative budget is federally funded. Yeah, when I took the job, the way it was described to me when I first went in to talk to them about taking the job was, I don't want to say it's a ground up rebuild, but they kind of trail off. I mean, that was the way it was kind of put to me. And I said, well, I'm up for a challenge. We were working with limited staff. We had quickly identified a way to staff up, not to the level that we needed to be, but to add around 40 additional people to the office. And so we were making an effort to attack those problems, the staffing issues. But yeah, when I walked in, the office was in bad shape, and largely due to externally it was all staffing. Closing the field offices also had the effect of making the phone wait times go up, because the way we wanted to help people was you could email, you could get on the phones, you could walk into an office. You have 3 on-ramps to UI. When you close any of those on-ramps, it's just going to funnel it, and basically everything had gotten funneled to the telephones. And so that was one of the things we did.
So would you agree with the statement that your
Senator, you
office
need to redirect your question
Oh,
through
I'm
the chair.
sorry. I don't know the rules.
And it's 10 o'clock and we need to move on.
I'll let go of that. I just want to say one thing. I come from a different world. I come from the world of medicine. And in my world, had I been aware of a data breach in my system and went home that day without knowing that the system had been shut down, I would have been committing a crime. I don't know what the security systems you have in place are, but I will tell you, I feel that you going home without addressing it on the 22nd, when apparently you're the first person in the administration to have been notified of this data breach, and you left your office without closing down the systems, I don't understand how.
Ma'am, Mr. McNamara is not on trial here today. We're not having a cross-examination. We've invited him here today
I just find
to
that
present.
confusing and reprehensible.
Senator
Out of
Co-Chair
order, Mr.
Carroll has a
Chairman.
question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I
Senator
think I
Carroll
have the
has
floor.
the chair and the floor, and he will ask a question.
Mr. Muncie, are you aware what the unemployment rate was back last November?
It's about 4.5%.
Do you know what it is today?
It's about 47% or so.
So obviously there wasn't a need for all those unemployment offices back in November.
I would disagree with that somewhat because, it did create a backlog, and we were getting complaints about the phone lines before that, because by closing those offices, like I said, the more on-ramps you give people into the system, the less one of them is going to get overwhelmed. And when you close the offices, more and more, all the people could do was call in essentially. And so that pushed the phones. And when we opened up those offices, that was part of how we got the phone lines more under control and dropped the wait times, the whole times down to from over an hour down to on average 20 minutes, was people had the opportunity then to walk into a center instead of sitting on hold for over an hour. So that made a significant difference. So people weren't getting the service they needed even after those, after those offices were closed because they were just sitting on hold forever.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Representative Freeland.
Thank you for being here, Mr. McNamara. If you remember when the Legislative Research Commission offered about 100 employees, staff members, attorneys, very qualified people, policymakers, many who already deal with confidential information. Do you know why or what discussions took place as to why those employees were not allowed to be involved more? It seems like if security was the reason, we used, your testimony has where we used outside vendors for telephone calls, third-party vendors to process claims. It seems like our LRC staff would have been a good means and already dealt with confidential information.
I don't know why they ultimately did not use the LRC staff. I know that towards the end of my tenure there, I was speaking with Mr. Floyd about arranging for that. And I would have welcomed them. I don't know why ultimately they didn't go forward with that. Again, the backlog that we had was largely with a lot of adjudications, the claims that are being held up that need to be investigated. Could have trained people to adjudicate, because we did in a pretty quick amount of time. A day or two, and then they could have been deployed. Like I said, we would break it down into one issue instead of the whole world for people. So I would have welcomed it. I don't know ultimately why they decided not to utilize those people.
Senator Wilson.
He asked my question.
So okay. Representative Huff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McNamara, thank you. Besides UI staff, can you share what other executive branch staff has helped process claims?
Sure. First of all, we pulled in from all over, particularly the workforce side of the Economic Education and Workforce Development Cabinet. A lot of the offices up there were essentially de facto shut down because all the businesses were shut down, because a lot of what they do is business related and education related and training related. So they didn't have a lot. So we were able to pull in pretty much that entire workforce side and put them to work doing a variety of things, particularly adjudications. So we had that. We had people from the education side of it that offered to help out. Because with schools being closed, some stuff slowed down for them as well. So, in the cabinet, it was an all hands on deck attitude. So we pulled in a lot of those people. I know the governor's office provided staff, and they were adjudicating claims for us. We had discussions with some other places. Again, we were just trying to find more and more people to help out with the adjudication stuff. And I don't know where some of those discussions, because they were preliminary when I was there, I don't know where some of those discussions ended up going, but at least that I can commend everybody inside the cabinet, everybody that worked there. They stepped up big time to try and help out here.
All right. Thank you for your answer, Mr. McNamara. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Representative Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McNamara, a question first and then probably a comment. To whom did you raise your concerns about appointment to the Unemployment Insurance Commission, and was there a response given? If so, what was that response?
I raised my concerns to primarily two people, the deputy secretary and the general counsel at the time. And the response was, one was more concerned about it, and one was actually kind of angry that I raised the issue.
And which one was which?
The deputy, or the general counsel was was kind of angry that I raised the issue.
Because it was an improper issue, or why?
You'd have to ask her. I don't think that she, I mean, I feel like she didn't like that it was her deputy general counsel that was being appointed. I don't know that she appreciated me raising the issue. I know she didn't feel like I raised it soon enough, but of course, you're dealing with a chaotic environment, and sometimes you're kind of looking around at everything that's going on, and you're like, wait a minute, now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, that doesn't seem quite right to me. So yeah, I told both of them about my concerns.
A comment, Mr. Chairman. One, thank you for being here today. I would suspect that each member on this committee has had untold numbers of people contact them from their districts and even outside of districts saying, please help. This is a bad situation with COVID. It is a bad situation with a statewide shutdown. It is a bad situation with unemployment, which is that safety net. We deal with each of those constituents, and everyone else is trying to do the same thing. Part of what the legislative branch does is oversight, not to point fingers, not to accuse, not to blame, but try to determine what has happened. If it's gone right, do it again and do it more. If it's gone wrong, determine what it is and not do that again and adjust. At this point, we don't know whether COVID will rear its head and we start to spike now, in the fall, in the spring, or another virus from whatever origination point. Something like this happens again. My guess is we will need unemployment insurance to work effectively if there is a county by county shutdown or a regional shutdown or a statewide shutdown. The only way that this body can figure that out and render proper oversight, which is part of our function on behalf of each of our constituents, is for people like you to come in and try to state the facts and their recollections as best they can. I appreciate that, and I appreciate it more so because of what I'm about to tell you, and you know it, but I'm saying it out loud.
Well, thank you, sir.
Be ready. There are many among us and others that want to know what happened to prevent it from happening in the future, whatever has gone wrong, and make it better. There are many others out there that will personally attack you, politically attack you, economically attack you, social media attack you in every which way ad hominem can be imagined to make sure that you don't speak out, and make sure that if you have any kind of whistleblower mentality, then don't you, whoever you may be, speak out in the future. So I appreciate you coming in and speaking and trying to outline what you know has happened to help us understand, not for blame, but for understanding. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. McNamara, I do have a question I want to ask you. I do want to say that I appreciate you being here today. I know this has not been easy, and I do appreciate you coming forward and sharing your testimony. I do have a question about the circumstances surrounding your termination, and I want to make sure that I understand this because I think it's very telling. You received a written reprimand or corrective action letter the same day that you discussed with the Cabinet's General Counsel concerns about a possible conflict of interest with the Cabinet's General Counsel serving as the Commission's chairman. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on that. Senator Carroll, do you have some comments?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Just a couple other quick questions. Do I understand correctly that the day that you submitted the letter regarding your concern about the contract employees was the day that you were notified that they were receiving the required training?
I knew they were receiving the training. It wasn't so much like that. It's just I raised concerns, and the more I kind of raised them, the more I felt strongly about it. And so that's the day that I wrote the letter and submitted the letter. But I knew the training was going to happen that day.
Okay. Is it possible that, and I know Deputy Secretary Benton testified that the issue with the breach was probably a glitch. Is it possible that with incorrect data entry, and would the contract employees have the ability to do what happened during the declared breach?
I suppose anything's possible. I suppose that would be possible because the documents thing, that's the identity verification part of it. Because if you have to prove who you are because you answered your security questions wrong or whatever, then you have to submit and upload, driver's license, social security card, 2 forms of ID, and there's a variety of them, right? So you have to submit that and upload it. It's probably less likely data entry, but it could be. You can go in and you can upload it yourself into your folder, which you wouldn't be able to do that into somebody else's. But you can also fax or mail in your documents, and then somebody would have to manually go do that and correct it. So I suppose it is possible. And to do an identity verification, you would have to go in and access somebody's document section to put those documents in there.
Okay, and just one final question. Can you go through the process that led to you being hired as the director of the Office of Unemployment Insurance?
Sure, absolutely. The technical process is anybody that wanted to work in the administration had to apply. You had to submit, your resume, cover letter, just like you would for a job, and you had to apply through their transition team website and state areas of interest and things like that. Okay, so you had to apply. That's the technical what you had to do. But I'll fully acknowledge that because it's very public knowledge at this point that I worked for the Bashir campaign. I raised money for the Bashir campaign. I gave money to the Bashir campaign. I knocked on probably personally around 1,000 doors for the Bashir campaign in and around Nelson County. So I did work for that. My family, we had a pre-existing relationship with the lieutenant governor, and it was the lieutenant governor who offered me this position. So
prior to applying?
No. I had to apply, and I was frankly surprised that she had, when she called me specifically because I had listed several interests. So, but I had to apply just like everybody else. I had to apply.
Was there any discussion with anyone from the administration regarding a job prior to you applying?
No.
Okay.
I think I had made it very clear to them that I would like to come help them and work for the administration, but there was no, okay, well, we'll find something for you or anything like that. There was none of that. Okay. It was all very one-sided for me, saying I would like to come be a part of this new administration and help out in any way I can, any way you see fit to use me. And then they told me you must go apply through our transition website. And then after all of that, I later received a call from the lieutenant governor.
Very good. Thank you so much for your frankness. Thank you for coming forward. Obviously, there are concerns about what happened during the duration of this incident in many different areas. And, I hope we can get some more answers in relation to this. But I appreciate you. It's rare that someone has the guts to come forward and just lay everything out on the table. And Mr. McNamara, you have gained a little respect from me today, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mr.
Appreciate that, sir.
I do have one final question before we close out. What was the response that Beth Rowart gave you when you raised concerns about the call centers?
When I filed the letter, I handed it to 3 people. I handed it to the Deputy Secretary, the Commissioner of Workforce Investment, who was my immediate supervisor, and I handed it to Beth Rowart, the head of HR. I gave it to her because I asked her to include a copy in my personnel file, so it would always be there. We had a later discussion about that letter, and she told me she didn't think it was very smart that I did that. And I said, why? Because it's going to hurt me, professionally or whatever? She said, no, because now if something happens, we've got an employee on record who already pointed it out as a risk.
Mr. McNamara, I want to thank you for joining us here today, for giving your presentation.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, point of order.
We are closing out this.
Mr. Chair, this is not the Republican
Democrat
Education Committee on Workforce Development. Mr. Chair, this is a committee in
Not
which you've
finished
allowed
with the work of unemployment insurance. in the state.
16 out of
There's a lot
17 members,
questions.
Mr. Chair, you've
left
allowed
to
to
be
ask questions are Republican.
And I will
Now,
thank you.
this gentleman was
defer
called,
to Senator Byrd.
Mr.
Senator Byrd asked a
McNamara was
question,
called to
so-
testify at the last minute. I insist
Senator
that Democratic
Thomas, you're out of
legislators
order.
get a chance to ask him questions.
We have
Mr.
a
Chair.
motion to adjourn this committee meeting.
Mr. Chair, no.
We have a
Mr.
motion to
Chair,
adjourn. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Committee meeting is adjourned.